Hello and welcome back to the Data Privacy Lawyer. My name is Funmi Owolabi and I'm the principal attorney. Today's review, we're going to be looking at cookies. This organization sells some clothing. We've got the cookie banner. We use cookies and other tracking technologies to improve your browsing experience on the site. We collect data and use cookies for ad personalization and measurement. Cookies may be used for personalization and non-personalized advertising. Visit the Google Privacy and Terms site to find out more about how Google uses this data. So I'm hoping and presuming that there's going to be more details on how Google relates to this organization. Using this website means you're okay with the cookie policy. So we've only got one button, which is accept and close. I think there's a couple things that we should talk about first before we get into the policy that they provided. The first thing is we see a pound sign. So something tells me that at a minimum, the products are being sold in the United Kingdom. Now, we don't have much context outside of that, but what we do know is that cookies constitute personal data, which is why I review them on my channel. The second thing I want to talk about is there is some terminology here that I think might have some value in providing definitions on what it constitutes. I've talked a lot on this channel about how us as legal professionals, we don't just interpret the law, but we also draft documents for different types of audiences. The reason I mention that is we've got the word student in here, we've got an age group, and then we have something called apprentice. So one of the questions that I generally will ask on my intake form that I draft and submit or distribute to clients is I always ask about the age of the users who will benefit from products and services. I don't want to go too much in detail about that because we're looking at cookies today. But there's generally lots of clues, which is why I do these reviews, because I think it's valuable for businesses to know the types of consideration a privacy lawyer is making when these are being drafted. Generally, right? Everything is going to depend on what an organization does. And that's why privacy is so specific business to business. You cannot apply privacy legislation across every business in the entire world because geography plays a part. You know, I told you about the pound sign that I've already recognized. The legislation that applies to processing of personal data in England is different to the legislation that applies to processing of personal data in the United States. That's the first thing. The other interesting thing I think about this banner is in the United Kingdom, prior to the processing of personal data for individuals, particularly when it comes to cookies. Okay, let's talk about cookies only, because it would be difficult to capture every single type of processing activity. And this review is on the cookie policy. Individuals whose personal data is going to be processed from a cookie capacity should be presented with the opportunity to either opt in to cookies being collected, particularly for instances where the cookie collection is not strictly necessary for the site to operate. So you can see here we have some options. They've got some cookies and tracking technologies that improve the browsing experience on the site. I cannot say for a fact that this is cookies strictly necessary for the site, but that's what it sounds like. Then we have another sentence here. We collect data and use cookies for ad personalization. Ad personalization is not a requirement for this site to function. It is something additional that this organization wants to conduct. And when that is the intent, legislation in the United Kingdom dictates that individuals should have the opportunity to opt into this. This is not something that should be automatic by any organization. So that's the first couple clues that I've picked up just from this banner. I am surprised to see just an accept and close button because it doesn't appear that we have the opportunity to opt in. Now, that being said, and I do want to make this very clear, a lot of organizations have functionality that can identify the geography in which an individual logs onto the site. I am not accessing this site from England because I am a US-based lawyer. So it may be that this website has captured my IP address and knows that I'm accessing the site from the United States. In the United States, the obligations on businesses is to give individuals the opportunity to opt out. So I can automatically be opted in to these activities like ad personalization and measurement. I am intrigued about why we've got a sentence about using cookies for ad personalization and measurement, and then we've got another sentence saying cookies may be used for personalized and non-personalized advertising. I am intrigued about what the distinction between these two sentences is. Hopefully we'll be able to identify that in the policy. But I do want to show you that little nuance because that type of insight is something that is studied and conveyed to clients by privacy attorneys. And it's definitely something that businesses should take into consideration because the geography where you offer your products and services are going to influence the type of legislation that applies to your business, and is also going to influence the manner in which your cookie policy or privacy notice or privacy policy is drafted. So I'm going to accept it and close it. And one thing I've been doing, particularly for these cookie reviews, is I try and take a look at managing my consent, right? So apparently, according to this cookie policy, we can manage the consent by clicking the cookie settings at the bottom of the site. I'm just going to go down. Okay, so I don't see the word cookie settings anywhere. Let me scroll up a little bit. Okay, again, I don't see the button that they've said is at the bottom of this site. So maybe that's an update that needs to be made. Let's go up and start looking at some of the provisions. The first thing that I can notice here is we don't have a date in which this policy was last updated. Let me just scroll to the bottom because sometimes it lives there too. So why is that valuable? In my opinion, it's valuable to have the date available when your notices and policies are last updated, because these sites are continually changing. If the manner in which you collect cookies is updated year in, year out, it's important to be transparent to consumers about the manner in which cookies are being collected, right? Let's say, for example, you had a website in 2010, and then you continue to make updates in how users can interact with the site, and that influences the type of cookies you collect on them. Being transparent about when your cookie policy or notice is updated is really valuable so that consumers know that your data protection practices are in line with what's required under the data protection laws. The other nuance I want to add here is we can see the evolution of data privacy legislation, right? In the United States, prior to 2018, we didn't have any US state privacy legislation. So we started to have the introduction of the CCPA in 2018. So let's say, for example, there's legislation that comes out in 2023, or it's already come out, and it influences how your organization processes personal data. That's going to influence what your privacy notices, including your cookie notice or cookie policy, is going to look like. Because if the legislation dictates that you do a particular action as a business, you need to adhere to that. So it's not just thinking about what you're doing internally as a business. You also need to take a look at the influence of the data protection legislation too. So what's a cookie? I think it's really valuable to always have definitions, and I wanted to make a mention of this with the banner. I saw that there was discussion about ad personalization. Organizations really need to think very carefully about who the audience is. Is a student like a layman's ideal or understanding? Would a student know what ad personalization constitutes? I know because I'm a privacy lawyer, but would an apprentice or student know? People that are visiting the site are likely going to be students, right? Because they've got uni days and youth discount. So the audience intended here is not, it could be a privacy lawyer, but generally it's probably going to be people buying dresses and clothing. There may be privacy lawyers among them, but most people are not going to be privacy lawyers that are reading this policy. The intended audience is probably going to be the students and apprentice, right? So having definitions of what constitutes a cookie, constitutes personalization, is very important. And if you're going to use language as a business that is very privacy specific, adding a definition to address your audience is going to be very, very important. One of the questions I always ask clients is, can you give me insight into how your products and services work? Because that is going to help me identify who the intended audience is. And I'll be able to draft a cookie policy that reflects that, right? If you're an organization and you only target children, the manner in which your privacy notice or cookie notice is going to be drafted is going to be very, very different to a privacy policy that is for doctors or patients, okay? Adult patients. Okay. Cookies are used for the personalization of ads on the first layer of consent notice. This is very interesting language. What is the consent notice? Is that this? Let me say something else. I think that every sentence on your public-facing privacy documentation really matters. I haven't read this entire thing, but I'm not entirely sure what the consent notice that they're alluding to is here, because the name of this document is cookie policy. But we've got this sentence that says cookies are used for the personalization of ads on the first layer of the consent notice. So I think there would need to be some insight into what this means, right? So let me tell you a bit about my work, because I think that'd be valuable. Not only do I draft and create these privacy notices and cookie policies and cookie notices from scratch, meaning clients will come to me and they don't have any type of notice at all. I also work on updating and improving notices and existing privacy policies so that they are compliant with what the business is now currently doing. I think I've done a couple of reviews last year on organizations that had notices that were 5 years old, 6 years old. Now, the reason I've stated this is because it may be at one point there was some type of consent notice associated with this policy, but as we're reviewing it right now, that doesn't appear to be the case. And if I don't understand what first layer of consent notice means, we have to think about, again, the intended audience here. Would a student understand what first layer of consent notice is? And would they even know where to go to find what the consent notice even looks like? Is the consent notice the cookie policy? And if it is, where is the relationship that has been drawn to ensure that users understand what this means? Every sentence matters. And when we think about things from a regulator perspective, I talk a little bit on my Instagram about fines that have been issued against organizations whose privacy programs have been found wanting, right? One of the key areas that you can see in regulators' write-ups and enforcement actions against organizations is the practices that they have dictated that they have on their site did not align with what was happening internally. Because when we create a privacy program, we are not just creating these public-facing documents. There's internal documentation identifying how privacy is handled that is then captured in a notice for our consumers. It's really important to relay appropriate language to your audience, but also ensure that internal practices reflect what's being done externally. Because whenever I do reviews on my YouTube channel, that's only for external facing privacy documentation. And that's not the only thing that privacy lawyers work on. So I hope you enjoyed this review. If you have comments, leave them below and I will see you in another review.